We are live with Heather Cox Richardson talking about the Trump attempt to, in effect, redefine America's identity. So, Heather, let me start by asking you this. Donald Trump and his administration have gotten increasingly blunt in describing a vision of America in which the real Americans are a limited number of people. White Christians, whites. Um, there's contempt for immigrants from certain parts of the world, which struck me as in direct conflict with what I was always brought up to believe, which is the message on the Statue of Liberty: "Give me your tired, your poor," and the notion that America was founded on an idea, not on blood and soil conception of who real Americans are. Um, Going back in history, am I right to think that that was the original way in which Americans thought of their land, and how durable has that foundation been over the years?
So I think the way to look at it is less to think about how it has changed through American history, because there are a lot of permutations from the framers of the Constitution, who in fact arranged a government in such a way that most people who lived in the colonies or the states at that point couldn't participate in the government, through the KKK, through, going forward. Um, it is worth thinking about two ways to look at human society. One is in which some people are better than others and have the right to rule. And the other is the idea that we are all created equal and have the right to be treated equally before the law, to have a right to have a say in our government, and a right to have equal access to resources, including things like healthcare and education. Both of those strands have run through American history. So if you're looking at the strand that Donald Trump is trying to put into place now, and I would say in addition to Trump, people like Stephen Miller, his White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Russell Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who was a key author of Project 2025. There's a whole bunch of players in Trump's circle. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, her advisor, Corey Lewandowski, who are trying to put in place what I would call a Nazi worldview, in which they are taking that idea that some people are better than others, that has in fact been part of American history since the beginning, from the founders into the framers, into elite Southern enslavers, into the white supremacists of the late 19th century, into the rise of the second KKK, into the neo-Nazis of the 1920s, into the Dixiecrats, and so on. They are trying to turn that strand into something that really harks back to Nazi Germany. And you can see that on the Substack and the Blue Sky and X feeds of Homeland Security, which is literally taking the equivalent of Nazi posters and using them in America today. So you have
Well,
that, but you also have on the other side what you have just identified, the idea that America stands for equality, and that idea. And the question is, which one of those will win out in this moment? When they have competed in the past, the one that you and I adhere to has always won. It's been a struggle, but it has always won. And right now, I think what you're seeing is the administration doubling down on that first, some people are better than others vision, because they recognize their power is slipping away, and they're grabbing as much as they can, as quickly as they can, in the hopes that they will outrun those of us who are gathering momentum.
well, you've started to hear this more explicitly from some Trump acolytes as well. Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama, said Muslim Americans are here to conquer, and we should get them out of the country immediately. Randy Fine, a congressman from Florida, who I wrote about this in a column today, said not all cultures are created equal. Um, what I started the column with was Paul Ryan saying we are the first country founded on an idea not of class, not of race, not of religion. Um, would you say that this challenge being posed by the current president and his acolytes is comparable to what's been happened in the past, stronger, or less likely to succeed, weaker?
Well, it's stronger in the US right now because although we have certainly had it most dramatically in the 1850s, the 1890s, and then again in the 1920s, which is what people nowadays tend to remember with people like Henry Ford, what we have now is a group of people who believe that in charge of the federal government. So they're using the tools of the government to destroy the institutions that support the kinds of ideas that you just articulated, which, by the way, were also articulated by people like Ronald Reagan. Not, Paul Ryan, of course, but, you can go on through the list of Theodore Roosevelt and Fannie Lou Hamer. And, basically all of our heroes have embraced that idea. So they are more powerful in that sense, but they are also significantly weaker. And one of the things that's worth looking at when we talk about their attempt right now to force this through in a number of decisions we've seen just today, um, is the political side of that. Why are they doing this? It is not popular. We know that Donald Trump is not popular. His popularity ratings are in the mid 30s, which, food poisoning actually comes in somewhat higher than that, I think. And yes, I'm exaggerating, but those are really low numbers. His individual issues are polling incredibly low. People don't like what he's doing. There is increased support for immigration in America. People are increasingly talking about the Constitution and the principles that they care for. So why are they doubling down on this idea of essentially neo-Nazism? And you see this in the the young Republicans of New York, for example, who had their gala in New York City over the weekend that literally had people embracing that kind of ideology that I'm talking about. And I think the answer to that is they're really hoping they can turn these people out to vote again in such a way that they will be able to preserve the Republican control of the House of Representatives and the Senate in the 2026 elections, combined with, of course, the gerrymandering they're trying to force through and so on, because they recognize that if they don't do that, if they lose control of the government, they're actually in real legal trouble. So the incredible push here, I think, is ideological for sure among people like Stephen Miller and Russell Vogt. But I also think it is a political push, and the question is whether they're going to be able to capture the machinery of the government to keep themselves in power. I think they've lost ideologically. But as I said when you started that question, the different thing now is that these people who have this hierarchical vision of society have captured the federal government, and that's a whole new kettle of fish.
You talk about losing the ideological battle in the society. I talked to the Public Religion Research Institute, which does a lot of very effective polling on this subject. And they broke out for me the distinction between MAGA Republicans behind Trump and everyone else. And what you had with the MAGA Republicans was statements that being US born and Christian are important to being truly an American. They support the tactics of ICE. They want internment camps for immigrants before they are sent overseas. They support masked agents going around. 7 out of 10 support that. 55% say the United States government should declare that America is a Christian nation. But when you go to everyone other than those MAGA Republicans, it's flipped. 7 and 10 oppose those ideas. So I wonder if you think that alignment of public opinion is similar to what we've experienced in the past, or is there something different about the reassertion of this idea that, as you mentioned, Reagan endorsed before he left the presidency? He said, you can move to France, but you can't be a Frenchman. You can move to Germany, but you can't be a German. But anybody can come to the United States and become an American.
And just to clarify, that was the last official speech he gave before he left office. So he was doing it very deliberately to sort of give it momentum. That wasn't some casual statement he made. So I do want to point out there's a moment that we tend to forget about in our history in which in the late 19th century, a number of people on the reactionary right did try to amend the Constitution to say that this was a Christian nation. And Congress basically laughed them out of the room with these very powerful statements. And one man, in fact, defended his Muslim constituents. This idea that somehow Muslims arrived in America a minute and a half ago is is just completely ahistorical. In fact, the first two non-indigenous people to set foot on on what was to become the United States, um, although I'm not going to argue about where the Vikings were, but the first two people, one of them was Catholic and one of them was Muslim. So, we have that long history as well. So this has happened before. That sort of thing has happened before. But I want to go in a little bit of a different direction, which is something I know you wouldn't ask me about, but I'm playing with a lot now. And I just want to also shout out PPRI. They're very, very good. So is AP Norc. People all say the polls are terrible, but those really are not. They're worth reading. Um, One of the things that really interests me about MAGA, and yes, you're always going to have those reactionary people. You're always going to have the people who hate people who are different than them. There's going to be 20 to 25% of the population that's just a reactionary part of a population. That just political scientists will tell you that. But, one of the things that jumps out to me nowadays are the know-nothings from the 1840s and the 1850s, because they're a movement that rises primarily in Massachusetts, but also in New York, that is virulently anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. They're actually known as the American Party. They are become known as the know-nothings because when people ask them about their organization, they're supposed to say they know nothing, sort of early Sergeant Schultz. And
So they were conscious of the unpopularity of what they were pushing. That's
well,
why they would say no nothing.
yes, but that was also partly what they were doing was implying that they had to be secret because otherwise the Catholics would come for them. There was a lot of conspiracy stuff surrounding it. But what's really interesting about that is that when you got the rise of the Republican Party in about 1855, 1856, a lot of those know-nothings switched over to become Republicans. Quite powerfully, a man named Henry Wilson becomes a leader in the Republican Party, and he had been a leader of the know-nothings. And yet, in their first two political platforms and then going forward, the Republicans call for immigration and they call for a lack of discrimination. So, what makes the difference between Henry Wilson in 1850 and 1856? And the answer to that, scholars who study this, and I am not one of them, I just read the ones who do, say is that what the Know Nothings were really upset about was an economic system that was squeezing them out, and they turned against the immigrants that they saw as competing for their jobs, primarily on the docks in Boston, but also in New York, as a way to push back against this economic system that was essentially screwing them over. And when the Republicans rise, and people make the mistake of thinking that the Republicans rise as an anti-slavery party, that is certainly part of what's going on, but their ideology is against the slave power. And the slave power was that group, a small group of elite Southern enslavers who were dominating the political system and were trying to spread human enslavement across the country with the idea that they would be able to monopolize land, monopolize resources, and that all other workers, whom they called mudsills, would essentially have to work for them. So Henry Wilson writes a book called The Rise and Fall of the Slave Power. And with that recognition that could be represented by an active, strong political party that was not going to cave to those guys the way the Whigs had or the Democrats had, you had a number of those know-nothings saying, yeah, we're going to be Republicans from now on. And sure, we don't care about immigration. What we really care about is getting rid of those guys. So when you look at this whole mess that's around us, one of the things that I am watching is the dramatic increase in rhetoric and positioning against the billionaires, especially the tech bros, because I think that gives an opportunity and perhaps a harbinger of a major political realignment around a different set of issues.
Well, one thing that you just said strikes me in an odd way as slightly hopeful uh, and positive. Uh, back then and as well as now, that if the motivation is not truly at bottom hatred of the other, hatred of Catholics, hatred of Poles at the turn of the century, or Italians, or people coming in who did not look like the people who were already in the country. If it's more about economic um, difficulties, that's something that a strong economy could, at least in part, um, deflect or reduce. Now we've had a debate since Trump started, like, oh, is it economic anxiety or is it racism? But how do you judge it on that continuum when you think about that experience of the know nothings who went after the slave power, as some people are going after the billionaires today?
Well, I'm a big believer in the idea that you can't disentangle race and class in the United States, especially after the Civil War, but certainly before the Civil War. And I don't want to suggest at all that somebody who has been as virulently anti-immigrant as some of the people that we know of have been is suddenly going to say, "Oh, never mind," and please, I'm going to welcome everybody. Those things are not going to go away. They do, however, tend to downplay a lot during times that are economically advantageous to everybody. And you can see this, I think, in the ideology of the Biden administration, which tended not to pay a lot of attention to these extraordinary divisions, with the idea that if you could make the economy better for everybody, they'd stop picking on each other. And I think that that was the ideology behind what the Biden administration was trying to do. It obviously didn't work, and I think it didn't work largely because of the media ecosystem in that moment. But in terms of looking at how people vote in 2026, 2028, which is, of course, what's on the table right now, the idea of the economy and the fact that Trump promised to make an economy better and, in fact, is doing the opposite, I think is really going to matter a lot. Now, there's also, I'm going to be a Libra historian here, there's also a poison pill in that generally you get the rise of authoritarians when the economy is bad and they can actually make it better. Trump came in with an economy that a lot of people interpreted as bad, even though it was actually getting better for a lot of people, and he's made it significantly worse. So whether that will mean people will say, I need a strong man to handle things, or whether they will say, let's toss this baby overboard and go back to the kind of system that gives us an input, I think the jury's still out. But I am, in the larger scheme of things, it looks to me like we are looking at a major political realignment of both parties, in which you've got the Republicans sliding off through MAGA, not just ideologically, although that's what I study, but through the actual mechanics of the party. And Trump took over the party. He's got all the email lists. He's pissed off all the women who stuff the envelopes. He's really taken over the mechanics of that party. So you've got the Republican Party sliding off there to the far right, which enables people who are interested in recreating a government that answers the needs of other people to pick those people up and to redefine a way forward the same way that the Republicans did in the 1850s, for example, or the Democrats did in the 1890s, and then again in the 1930s. So I look at it every day as wondering, what is today's change? And today, of course, we've got four and possibly five Republicans who signed on to a discharge petition to extend the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits. Now,
Well,
that's not MAGA. That's not MAGA. That's not a MAGA
that's right.
ideology.
One of the things that's different about this moment is that we are on track for the first time in American history to becoming a society that is not majority white. That's a profound fact. And I think the Trump administration alluded to what it really fears here in its recently published national security strategy, where it said that Europe was in danger of civilizational erasure if the societies there become majority non-European. Does that make, since we are on track to becoming a majority minority country, does that make this moment one of higher stakes and more intensity than we've seen in the past?
Do you know, I don't think so. And I have very little patience with that argument for any number of reasons. But I'm going to start with the obvious one. In the periods that I just talked about in the 1840s and 1850s, for example, guess who wasn't white? The Irish. If you want to take a look at the 1890s, guess who wasn't white? The Italians and the Poles. So when you start talking about being white, mean, that is, you hear and people roll their eyes at the idea that race is a social construct. But, quite literally, some of the people who are now arguing for civilizational decay would have been on the wrong side of that equation in the time of their grandparents and their great grandparents. So, the world is changing. And listen, I'm an old white lady from way, way back. But what are you going to do? Like, say we're going to wall ourselves off from the rest of the world? Or are you going to say, hey, wow, this is great. We got new ideas. We got new languages. We got new entrepreneurs. We got new everything. And, since that's coming anyway, I say embrace it.
Um, Let me ask you about terminology because some people describe what we're seeing in different ways. And I wonder which you think is the propulsive force. Some people use terms like white supremacy. Some people use terms white nationalism of the blood and soil variety. Other people say white Christian nationalism. Eric Schmidt, the senator from Kansas, said the other day, we Americans are the descendants of Christian pilgrims who came to embody their faith in this country. What do you think is the right way to describe this? Because obviously, one of the drivers within the White House of these policies is Stephen Miller, who, of course, is Jewish.
So again, I think you've put your finger on something there. They're all very slippery terms that say we are better than you. And you define it differently depending on which kind of a group you're trying to pick up. But that idea that first of all, we is carrying a lot of weight there in that Schmidt quotation, but that we are descendants of Christian, did he say Protestants?
Pilgrims.
Pilgrims. Well, first of all, just don't even start me on the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Puritans. But second of all, who's the we in that? Before those people even came, of course, they're indigenous Americans, there's Spanish Americans, there's the fishermen who settled my state of Maine, who, believe me, were not over here to worship unless it was the cod. So that idea that we are somehow related either to the land or to a religion or to a certain group of people just doesn't make sense as a nation. It is really a very presentist way to look at the United States of America, and ultimately a losing way. I mean, one of the things that we don't talk about, which kind of frustrates me, is you keep hearing the people who define themselves that way as talking about how they're going to make America great again. Well, here's a news flash. America has done extraordinarily well for 250 years, almost 250 years, as a country that is working incredibly hard to be inclusive, to be based on an idea. And the idea that somehow we're going to make ourselves greater by getting rid of public health and getting rid of science and getting rid of education and getting rid of immigrants and getting rid of all the things that have defined us, and that we know from the actual way the past played out have in fact made America great, just strikes me as one of the biggest, self goals in world history, not just
I
American history.
I agree with that. Before we go to viewer questions, let me just ask one more kind of summary. As we get to the end of 2025, with Trump in the weakened state that he is, how confident are you that the Statue of Liberty America, the founded on an idea America, is going to prevail going forward?
So I'm going to answer that in a way that you're not going to like. That is, I am 100% convinced it is going to prevail, 100%. And on this one, I'm going to channel my inner Thomas Paine in the same way that he did in the American Crisis, the anniversary of which is, I think, tomorrow, although I don't actually know what day it is today, so I'm not sure I can say that. And that's that it is going to prevail because this is the ultimate definition of what it means to be a human, to determine your own fate. And that's what the United States has always represented. But I can't tell you if it's going to prevail tomorrow or in a week or in a month or in a year or in 10 years or in 50 years or in 100 years. What will make that difference is the number of people who stand up today and say, this is the world we want. Because eventually we're going to get there, but the question of when it's going to be is going to depend on how many people do it.
And the poll numbers I mentioned are very powerful, but as we've seen in other issues, take gun control, for example, you can have overwhelming majority sentiment that is not activated and not doesn't become effective political pressure in our political system. So even though 7 in 10 Americans, let's say, who are not part of MAGA, uh, subscribe to the more welcoming America we're talking about, they have to do something about it. Um, let me go to a couple viewer questions. Theodore DeFelicio says, what do you think about the distinction between political polarization and tribalism? Are they different? Are they the same?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I've never thought about it that way. I think they are different, but this is like because of the stuff I study, we actually spent a lot of time in history talking about nationalism and tribalism and all that. I would suggest that tribalism is more a society kind of imposition of organization on groups that you consider yourself part of, and that those can be swapped because you end up in a number of you can define yourself in a number of different ways. But political polarization has been a deliberate attempt on the part of leaders trying to get into power to exploit that tribalism to convince people that they are in either category A or category B, and that those categories themselves are really artificial. So you can think about the many issues that we care about in society, and you can care deeply about three of them and not care at all about two of them. Or you could be in a different pattern, but you have been artificially divided into A and B through political polarization. And one of the things that I would like to see, and by the way, that James Madison talked about in Federalist Number 10, is the idea of recognizing how American concerns about specific issues can be used to pressure our lawmakers to act in specific ways rather than simply saying, well, I'm a Republican, so I'm going to go along with everything Donald Trump does, or I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to go along with whatever they do. And, the issue of gun safety is a great example of that, because after Sandy Hook, there was overwhelming desire in the United States of America for some kind of legislation for background checks and so on. And that was stopped by a filibuster in the Senate. That was a minority of senators who exerted their pressure under, or their power under the mechanics of the system to stop something that was overwhelmingly popular. And that shouldn't be okay. We should be in the streets to say, dudes, do what we want. They work
Right.
for us.
Narik has a question, which is, how do we as a country come to terms with and synthesize the fact that we were founded with the concepts of equality and racism, slavery at the same time?
So I think that's the central tension in the United States. And that goes back to that same idea of some people are better than others versus everybody should be equal. And what I would say to you is this: what I have come to believe is that neither one of those is really the story that defines America. What defines America is the struggle of individual people to expand democracy, to expand their rights, to expand their ability to become whoever it is that they want to be.
To
So,
perfect the union, in other words,
pardon me?
to perfect the union.
To perfect the union, but also to redefine the country not as something we used to have or as something that we aspire to, or something that we need to get away from, but to define the country as a struggle, as a fight for democracy. Because if you do that, the people who own democracy are you and me. We're the ones who are trying to figure out how to do chemistry, or how to vote, or how to put a roof over our heads, or how to get our child with a learning disability an education. And when you think about democracy as a process, but a process of creative endeavor to expand rights and privileges as well as duties, you can reconcile those two things because neither one of those defines us. We define us, and we define ourselves through struggle. And that strikes me as being a good definition of the United States, but also a good definition of humanity. And bringing those two things together strike me as being a good thing for the United States in this moment.
Well, and it also helps people get more comfortable with the idea that um, uh, the other side of that struggle is not new or novel. It's what society has always dealt with, and we have to keep dealing with. Jenny Bloom has a question from a somewhat darker point of view. how would you compare the moment that the United States is facing with moments in history where uh, empires collapsed? Could it be that we are collapsing? The United States, which is, of course, was the hegemon of the world over the last 30 years, could we be collapsing?
So I think as a world power, yes, I think the United States has walked away from the table. It was not something that I wanted to see happen. I actually talked about it before Trump took office. But it doesn't mean that history is going to end. It doesn't mean that the United States is going to end. It means that all of us in the United States, but in other countries as well, have to figure out what the world looks like without that elephant in the room. And that's going to have some really negative connotations, but also, if we handle it right, some quite positive connotations. So if you think about the United States, it has reconceived itself at least twice in the past. It reconceived itself after, first of all, it conceived itself in the time of the founders. It reconceived itself after the Civil War, and it definitely reconceived itself after World War II. We are now how many years out from that? Are we 40, 60, 80 years out from that?
Uh-huh.
We need to reconceive ourselves in such a way that we can handle the crises of the 21st century. And by that, I mean climate change and the migration and the disease that that's going to bring and so on. But in the past, when we have reconceived ourselves, the time of the founding, the time of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the time of World War II, we have in fact reconceived ourselves in extraordinarily productive and beneficial ways, not only for ourselves, but also for the rest of the globe. That's up to us now. So, like I say, I said before Trump took office, like, I don't want to see a world in which the United States, for all of its flaws, can't do things like back NATO with a rock solid conviction that they would not permit Russia to expand into the Baltics, for example. I don't want to see that world. Well, I got it anyway. So now that we've got it, I think we have very little choice but to say, what does it look like now to go forward? And that goes back to that idea that we are in the process of reconceiving our political parties, at least two of them, and reconceiving what issues we think are important, and reconceiving who we think are the right messengers to carry those issues forward into the 21st century.
One more question from a viewer before we run out of time. Helen Hamill raises the issue of misinformation, disinformation, which now is propelled by technology that moves faster than we've ever seen. Does that make a uh, does that make it a different element to this moment compared to the past, or has disinformation in many forms in the past been comparable to today?
Um, we have always had misinformation, which is a mistake, and disinformation, which is an outright lie, and in order to sway usually a political situation. And my favorite example of that is in the early republic. One of the the tricks that you could pull on your opponent was to tell the newspapers he was dead, because it's really hard to overcome it when people think you're dead. I mean, in a time when you don't have photographs and you don't have video and so on, how are you going to convince people that they should vote for you because you actually are alive? So we've always had that, but you're absolutely right, I think, to identify this is a moment in which disinformation has run rampant. But that has been part of a deliberate movement since at least the 1950s on the part of the reactionary right to create a false reality for people in which they believed, for example, that women and people of color and Black Americans in the United States were deliberately looking for a handout from the government to impose socialism. So you had people like Rush Limbaugh talking about the feminazis, if you remember, and always hounding people about the idea they were creating socialism, when in fact what the Americans after World War II, Republicans as well as Democrats, were looking for was a government that regulated capitalism so it didn't go completely out of control the way it has now, for example. So we've always had that, but we've had this moment in which we've had really this propulsion among people on the radical right to create this false reality. And I think, I alluded earlier to the idea that the Biden administration had tried to get rid of the political divisions in the 4 years that Biden and Harris were in office by making the economy better so that people wouldn't turn on each other. And, I wrote about that stuff. I wrote throughout the entire period, and it just didn't get picked up anywhere. The things that the Federal Trade Commission were doing, for example, to protect consumers and to bring down drug prices and all that just did not make it into the political uh, press simply because I think Trump was just using the orchestra pit idea of the media that, you jump into the orchestra pit and then people cover you. Now, of course, people are seeing it more because it's really hurting them. But one of the things that's happened, and it began before Biden even took office, but really has taken off now, is you have people like John Harwood, who goes onto social media with videos like this and gives you the actual facts of what are happening. And I've heard a lot of people talking about how this is left-wing media, but I don't think that's fair to say. I think what people like John and I are doing is actually explaining to you, explaining, not saying this happened and you should care about it, but saying, hey, you really care about the fact that today 4 Republicans in the House of Representatives told Mike Johnson to pound sand and signed on with the Democrats because they recognize that letting the affordable health care premium tax credits expire is going to send healthcare premiums skyrocketing for 24 million Americans. That's not the kind of thing that you would have gotten before about 2015. And that shift in our media ecosystem is mattering to the point that I think you're seeing a lot of pushback on the part of the tech bros to get rid of people like us. And that, I think, is going to be the battle going forward. If you watch, they are buying up CBS, the major platforms, Meta and so on, and keeping alive access to public eyeballs actually takes us right back to the founders and then the framers of this nation, where they gave us freedom of the press, but they also gave us a postal system, not because they wanted to write home to mom, but because they recognized that unless you had access to the public as a politician, you would end up unable to get your message out. And that, I think, is a correct thing to identify as a real problem going forward. And one of the reasons that I try and be on every single one of the major platforms in the fear that somebody will shut me off of one or another.
Um, Before I ask what I promise will be the last question, let me urge everyone to subscribe to Zateo, subscribe to Heather's Letters from an American Substack, which is incredibly vital to millions of people. Subscribe to my column, which is The Stakes on Zateo. My last question is this, and it's slightly off topic to the white nationalism issue that we've discussed most of the time. But I have to ask you about the behavior of the president the last couple of days. The statement that he put out after the horrific murder of Rob Reiner, the placing of derogatory information before formal portraits, below formal portraits of past presidents in the White House, saying Joe Biden was the worst president ever and Barack Obama was divisive and created the Unaffordable Care Act. Is there any analog in our history to a president who is, I don't know what the word for it is, depraved, mentally ill, malignantly narcissistic, somebody who is essentially off his rocker the way this president is?
Um, no, but let's start by going back a second and recognize that Rob Reiner's wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, was also murdered. Um, and recognize too that, I am not a doctor, but I don't feel like I need to be a doctor to take a look at his behavior, which really jumped out to me all the way back during the campaign when he just stood on that stage and swayed that night. Remember that?
Yep.
What I see is a child. What I see is somebody in their second childhood, if you will. I see somebody that needs mental health care. He needs memory care. He
There's
needs
something
somebody.
badly wrong with him.
There's something badly wrong with him, and he remember what we see is him at his best. This is not like, he's having a bad moment that somebody caught, like when poor George Bush threw up on the prime minister of Japan. You didn't have to like George Bush to be like, oh man, you're never going to live that baby down. And we've all had a moment like that, right? This is somebody who has descended into a childish narcissism that is madness. And in addition to what that means for the governance of this country, for me, where the presidency and the government is not really about any person or party or anything, it's about history. It's about that thread that runs through all of our lives, way back to the fishermen, right, who first came before the pilgrims. Um, and the indigenous people before them. To me, the sheer disrespect for us, because it is our government, it is our White House that he bulldozed. It is our Cohen building that he is threatening to bulldoze. It is our Congress. It is us. It is us and the idea that we as human beings can create a union of people to be governed by laws and not by men. The sheer disrespect to put up the paintings he's putting up and to put up those plaques and to talk about us the way he does is, to me, disqualifying before you even get to the fact that you have a man that you would not trust to clean your bathroom, handling the nuclear footballs and trying to negotiate with around the globe at a time when you have an aggressive Russia threatening Europe, and now we appear to be threatening Venezuela. To me, it's beyond that. And again, the issue for me as I look at this at a personal level, that upsets me. But if you're a Republican, and you're going to be running for office in 2026 and maybe hoping to run for office in 2028, you need to get him out of there. So when are you going to do that? Because you don't want to do it closer and closer to that election. You want to do it as quickly as possible. And I think that they have shown that they have absolutely no spine, but if they have political aspirations, somebody's got to find some way to move him off stage before he completely tanks the party in 2026. And if they don't do that, I think you can see the Republicans are already headed for the exits. But what
Pete,
is
Pete,
left
Pete
is
Wayner,
us
who
picking it
worked
up.
in, Pete Wayner, who worked in George W. Bush's White House, wrote in the Atlantic yesterday that Trump's inferno of rage and hate is intensifying. And at least on the calendar, we've got 3 years to go.
Well, again, not a doctor. I don't see him going on for 3 more years, but I am much more focused right now on what's going to happen tonight. Again, whatever expletive he pulls with Venezuela, uh, is gonna stick the United States. It's gonna devastate Venezuela and South America. But if you're a Republican who is hoping to become president in 2028, you don't want him to do that. You don't want to be stuck with a war that you've either got to get out of or push more into. So, I saw, and I won't mention names, but briefly across social media today, when a text saying that Trump was going to do something tonight about Venezuela that got taken down immediately. And I said to somebody, I saw it, and I said to somebody, I'm not sure it's settled yet because he probably wants to go to war with Venezuela or do something heinous to Venezuela. He's been talking that way for a long time. But if I were his advisors, especially one that was interested in running for office in 2028, as we know at least two of the people in the White House are anxious to do, I'd be tripping him on the way out the door, going, don't you even think about it because you're going to stick me with it, and I don't want to be stuck with it.
Heather Cox Richardson, we've taken way too much of your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great holiday, and we'll talk again in the new year.
You too, John. It's always a pleasure.